Hello, and welcome to NABA Perspectives, a weekly podcast by the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, where we take a look at some of the key themes, issues, and stories that are shaping economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Lanre Akinola, the head of content at NABA, and this week we're talking about a new scramble for Africa. If you go on to Google today and you type in the words new scramble for Africa, you will find dozens of news stories, research papers, and even books that have been written about a supposedly new scramble for the continent. And I came across an article on The Economist this week that captures, I think, quite well the part of the debate, part of this narrative, which is almost by definition sort of implies that something negative and something sinister is happening. The scramble for Africa, historically, of course, was used to refer to, or is used to refer to, Europe's colonization of the continent in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, thankfully, we're not talking about anything along those lines in the 21st century, but there is this emerging narrative that there's something sinister is happening. And let me just get up the Economist article here, which kind of ominously sets the scene. So the headline is "There's a new scramble for Africa," and then the strap line goes right in and says foreign meddling is spreading chaos and tyranny. And it talks about how foreign influence has seldom been kind to Africa. And it references the first scramble for Africa. It then talks about the Cold War, where, of course, we saw this competition between the US and the Soviet Union, where many African countries were used as proxies. And, and on neither occasion did it work out very well for Africa, to put it mildly. And if we fast forward to where we are today, according to The Economist, seeing China's success. So we're talking here, we all know about China's investment in Africa, which pivoted to the continent at the turn of the century. It says that seeing China's success, other countries have followed. Turkey and India have held summits, etc., etc. And this here, I think, is the operative, or one of the key sentences. This stampede has created opportunities for African countries in trade and investment, but economic and diplomatic jousting has since degenerated into proxy wars. All right, so fairly strong words there by The Economist. Let's unpack this a little bit, and let's have a bit of a discussion around this idea of a new scramble for Africa. And first, a bit of context. So the genesis of this, I would say, this isn't really anything new. The genesis of this is, as I already mentioned, when China essentially decided to strategically pivot towards Africa at the turn of the century. We all kind of know the story of China and Africa. We know that Beijing has poured billions upon billions of dollars into infrastructure development. Its influence has been steadily rising. And in more recent years, this has taken on a more geopolitical dimension. This was already underway before the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where there was growing discourse, particularly in the US, about the need to counter Chinese influence in Africa, that the US was somehow losing Africa to China. And it has really picked up in the last couple of years, I would say catalyzed by events in Ukraine. And now we have a fairly sort of straightforward global geopolitical split between the US and Europe, sometimes referred to as the collective West on the one hand, and then a sort of coalition of countries, if you want to call it that, at the center of which you find Russia and China on the other. And a lot of this is playing out in Africa. We've seen, particularly over the last 12 months, a real spike in this narrative, but also in the level of interest explicitly geared towards this geopolitical contest on the continent. We've seen high-profile visits by U.S. officials, Janet Yellen, Anthony Blinken. We've seen Sergei Lavrov visit the continent, and the common thread has been this geopolitical tension between the West and this axis of Russia, China, whatever you want to call it. And that geopolitical tension is definitely increasing. So the question here then is, are we seeing the return of great power competition in Africa? And I would say a worst case scenario of how you might look at this is that we're at risk of returning to a kind of Cold War scenario where African countries have to pick a camp, where you have where it becomes the scene of proxy wars, as The Economist suggests, and overall that this is a negative this is a negative trend and very bad news for the continent. Now, I would say that I respectfully disagree with that analysis. That's not to dismiss the importance of the geopolitical trends that we're seeing, and especially the geopolitical tension that we're seeing in Africa and the geopolitical competition between the great powers. However, I would say that an important dynamic that has to be factored into any analysis of this is that the growing geopolitical competition that we're seeing is, of course, symptomatic of this general global upending of the geopolitical order that we've all grown accustomed to in recent decades. This has really been accelerated over the last 2 years, and there's now widespread talk that we're moving into a so-called multipolar world. And a couple of things to say about this. First, when it comes to geopolitical tension, yes, it exists in Africa, but how is that any different from any other part of the world? It's not as though this rivalry is only playing out on the continent. It's playing out in every part of the world. You go to Asia, you go to the Middle East, you go to South America, you go to Europe. Right? The geopolitical context is a global one, and it is a part and parcel of world affairs. We may not like it. It may have negative consequences. That is all true. And we have to be vigilant about that. African countries have to be vigilant about that and the potentially destabilizing effects, the potential to undermine economic development on the continent. All of that is true. But all of that is true for other parts of the world as well. So there's nothing unique about what's happening in Africa. That's the first thing. But the second is that this idea of a multipolar world, whether or not you subscribe to that idea, what many people, or most people, agree on is that the geopolitical order is shifting and it's changing. The power dynamics, the political power dynamics, and very importantly, the economic power dynamics are shifting. And within that, I would say that there's actually significant opportunity for Africa, and something that I think really captures that opportunity is the BRICS. So we know that the BRICS have outgrown their roots as an acronym coined by the former Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill. And it's now morphed into, or increasingly is morphing into, a very significant global economic force, principally economic, of course, diplomatically as well. But I would say that it is primarily in the sphere of economy that the BRICS are starting to come into their own. And if you cast your mind back to August of this year, South Africa, which is, of course, a member of the BRICS, hosted the annual BRICS summit in Johannesburg. Well, we saw two things. One, we saw an example of the geopolitical tension and the great power politics, or the great power game, if you wish, play out there around the potential participation of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and whether or not South Africa would act on the ICC arrest warrant on him, and there were even accusations by the U.S. ambassador to South Africa that South Africa was supplying weapons to Russia, which, of course, Pretoria has categorically denied. But it was a good illustration of, on the one hand, the potential or the pressure that some African countries are invariably going to come under in this era of great power competition, or renewed great power competition. But I think, for me, the main takeaway is it also underlined the opportunities inherent in the emergence of a multipolar world order. The big announcement that came out of the summit, of course, was the addition of 6 new members, so more than doubling the size of the BRICS, from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to now also include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I think the key takeaway here is that 3 members of the BRICS, which is fast becoming an economic powerhouse on the world stage, whatever we might think about it. 3 of those members are now from Africa. So, in principle, the continent has a meaningful seat at the table of a group of countries that, in one way or the other, look set to play a very influential role in shaping the global economy. And in that, inherent in that, there must be a sense of opportunity. So, a couple of things to say about that. And I would say the emphasis really ought to be on the sort of transition into this multipolar world order. But to get back to Africa and this idea of the new scramble. So what we've seen over the last couple of decades is a gradual increase in something that's now becoming a bit of a frenzy, if you want to call it that, of countries internationally looking to the continent, looking to strengthen economic ties, principally with African economies, looking to invest. And while part of that is the great power game, so the U.S. has renewed its commitment to ramp up investment on the continent. Joe Biden hosted a big U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in Washington last December. China, of course, continues to ramp up its presence on the continent. The EU has come out and it has renewed its commitment to the continent. So the great power dynamic in Russia, of course, is also looking to renew its ties with the continent. So the great power dynamic is part of the picture, but it is only part of the picture. And it's important to remember that the group of countries, or the nature of the interest in Africa, is very diverse. And let's just run through a few stats here and just a few examples to illustrate the point. First of all, we have a country like India. So China is not the only Asian country that is significantly ramping up economic ties with Africa. This is trade volume between India and Africa as of last year, $102.6 billion. That's a lot. That's more than twice what the US traded with Africa in 2021. I think it was around 45 billion. Right? So that's a huge amount of trade that's coming out of India. You have a place like Turkey, a country that you might not think of when we talk about Africa and its international trade. But that country has increased its trade volumes over the last 20 years from just 5.4 billion to over 40 billion last year, coming close to the trade that Africa had with the US in 2021. We have the return of Brazil. And here I'm just going to quickly share a tab. Where is it? Here we go. So this is President Lula, who this was a few months ago, he spoke about how he wants to resume good and fruitful relations with Africa. And that's a reference to his first stint in office in the early 2000s, where he significantly ramped up economic engagement and cooperation between Africa and Brazil. And I would say we can expect a return to that. And very importantly, or more recent entrants are the Gulf states. So they are making significant inroads into Africa at the moment. And if you've been following the news recently, you'll know that there's just been a big summit in Saudi Arabia. So I believe it's a sort of a Saudi Africa summit, or an Arab summit, Arab Africa summit, which was hosted in Saudi Arabia. There were all sorts of announcements that came out of that, including this one here. Let me just load up the tab, where we have the Arab Coordination Group pledging $50 billion for African development. Right? Now, that's a significant sum of money. Incidentally, it's almost as much as the amount of money that China pledged, I believe, back it was 2018, to commit to development and infrastructure projects across Africa. And we all know that China is, China is often sort of talked about as this kind of almost like all-consuming force in Africa, that nothing happens in Africa that isn't somehow related to China, which I would say is simply not an accurate representation. Yes, China's influence is immense. There's no doubt about that, but it's not the only player. And $50 billion being pledged here is quite significant. We also had announcements by Saudi Arabia talking about. Here we go. There's an article here. Here we go. Here's Saudi Arabia talking about its plans for Africa. And we see here that the Saudi Fund for Development will sign agreements worth 533 million with African countries. Okay, that may not sound that impressive, but if we go down here to this paragraph, we read that Saudi Investment Minister Khalid Al-Falih later said at the same conference, so this is the conference that took place just last week in Riyadh, that the kingdom's more than $700 billion wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, will make some game-changing investments in Africa. Now, we don't know what those game-changing investments are, but I would be very surprised if we don't see some major announcements coming out of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in the coming months and years. And these aren't the only countries. There's, of course, also, there are the Nordics, and there's Norway as well. And here we have, here we go. Right, here's an update from Norway. Norway is, of course, in the process of developing a new Africa strategy. And a very important aspect of that is that here it says that the new strategy will emphasize the importance of trade and investments. Right? And I could go on. The point is that the interest that's coming into Africa is very diverse. It's not just these great power blocks. It's not just the West versus China and Russia. If you go across any part of the world, you will find countries that are actively ramping up their strategic engagement with the continent. The significance of that, I would say, being that this isn't some sort of ideological showdown. This isn't some sort of trend based on an ideology, based on some sort of, insidious political objective that's happening here. And for me, the key takeaway here is that, if there is a scramble for Africa, it's economic. No one's talking about, invading African countries. There's no sort of, foreign meddling, nowhere near. I mean, I don't want to sound naive about this. Of course, countries are vying for influence, but we're not seeing anything that resembles what we saw during the Cold War, for example. And not to speak of the original scramble for Africa. I mean, thankfully, we're nowhere near anything that looks like that. It is primarily in the sphere of economics that this competition is taking place, and I don't really see how that is inherently a negative for Africa. Now, if you're a good skeptic, as am I, as I am, you might be saying, okay, but hang on here. These countries, they aren't going to Africa to develop the continent. They're not going there for the benefit of Africa. They're going there to represent their own interests. And to that, I would say I agree. But that should be obvious. That should be a given. Right? That's just the nature of world affairs. Countries don't build partnerships or engage economically or diplomatically with other countries simply out of the kindness of their heart, simply because they want to come and help you. Right? That's simply not how it works. Of course, these countries are pursuing their own interests. They're looking to build their own influence. They're looking for their own commercial or economic or diplomatic advantage. Right? But that, again, is true of any kind of diplomatic or economic engagement that goes on around the world. There's nothing unique about that in Africa, and there's nothing new about that. Right? This should be self-evident, right? Which raises what, for me, is the real question and the real challenge here. Africa needs to define its role. What I mean by that is the opportunities in this emerging multipolar world order, let's call it that, for Africa, I would say, are unprecedented. We've never been in a situation where there are more potential economic partners out there that can help support and drive development across the continent, whether it's in terms of financing, whether it's in terms of technology, human capital, governance, whether it's infrastructure development, basically everything that you need to drive successful economic development, you now have, you know, potentially dozens of partners out there, great, big, and small, who are interested and ready to work with you. The challenge is you need to define your role within this emerging multipolar world. You need to define your own interests and have a very clear understanding of what your interests are. So if you want to partner with China, go for it, but have a very clear idea of what you need to get out of that relationship. Right? Know your objectives, negotiate good deals, sign good deals, have a clear strategic goal in that partnership. Same goes if you want to partner with the US, why not? Or maybe even both. Right? There's a thought. Right? This isn't some sort of replay of the Cold War. And I think I have one more article here that kind of really captures the essence of this. Let me just get this up on the screen. Here we go. So this is from the conversation. Africa is being courted by China, Russia, and the US. Why the continent shouldn't pick sides. I couldn't agree more with this sentiment. This isn't an either or, at least it shouldn't be. Now, there may be pressure on countries to adopt an either or stance. But the realities of the world today are simply not as constraining and as rigid as they once were, not as constraining and rigid as they were during the Cold War. The reality is that you can partner with different countries based on your interests. The key is you must know your interest. You must define your interest and you must push for that interest. Right? You can partner, but make sure that that partnership works for you as well as the other side. It's not up to the world to develop Africa. It's ultimately up to Africa to develop the continent. Right? And I'll just want to throw in there, I said, if you want to partner with the US, do it. China, do it. Turkey, do it. India, do it. Norway, do it. Right? Why not? Why not partner with Norway and the US, or Turkey and Norway, etc., etc.? I think you get my point. So to conclude this short discussion about this supposed new scramble for Africa, what I would say is really the emergence of a new world order. And within that, Africa's role is being redefined, potentially redefined. I would say that there is huge opportunity out there. It's not going to realize itself. I don't see this trend as being inherently negative, inherently damaging to the continent. But of course, nothing is guaranteed. It's all about making sure that African governments and countries, and I can't stress this enough, have a clear understanding of what their interests are, how to realize those interests, and to partner with countries internationally that are well suited to support those interests. And in conclusion, and this is a little bit ironic, I find it kind of interesting that while The Economist in 2023 warns us about this insidious scramble for Africa, I found this article from 2011, which also talks about the new scramble for Africa, but it says this time the winners could be Africans themselves. So I'm not sure what happened between 2018 and 2023 to change The Economist's mind. Sorry, actually 2019. To change The Economist's mind. But here it captures that essential point, right? Actually, there's a lot of opportunity for Africa. And if the continent plays its hands right, there's no reason why this new scramble for Africa can't be good news for the continent. All right, that's where I'm going to leave it for this week. I hope you found that interesting. It's a topic that no doubt we're going to be returning to in future podcasts. But that's all I'm going to say on this issue of the new scramble, the new multipolar world order that we're entering into for today. That's NABA Perspectives for this week. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe, like, share, the usual drill. And I will see you next week. Thank you.